Everybody, thanks for taking the time to join us today. Joined by Gene Kim and John Willis for an Ask Me Anything session related to Beyond the Phoenix project. Really appreciate all your participation. And before we get started, just want to go through a few housekeeping items. First and foremost, basically how to use the Zoom webinar. In the window, you'll see there's a chat option as well as a Q&A window. Feel free to submit questions there at any point in time. Or if you have a follow-up question, feel free to raise your hand using that button as well. I'll be making sure to moderate and curate the questions coming in for Gene and John. And we also had a few questions come in beforehand, so we'll start with those. And then any other questions that you have, feel free to turn it over. So with that, I'll give it to you, Gene.
All right, sounds good. It's great to be on here with my good friend, John Willis, and thanks for submitting your questions. Our goal is to get through all of them. And I want to just say how grateful I am for all your support on this amazing project that was Beyond the Phoenix project. John and I were talking beforehand, marveling that it only came out about a year and a half ago. It feels like a lot longer. And then John reminded me it was because we actually started it, long before that. So I'm looking forward to this. And again, my apologies for taking so long to get the schedule. And I'm so glad we're finally doing it today. John, over to you.
Hey, Gene. Yeah, great. It was so long, but it's really, like I said, it was only been a year. It just seemed, I think it's also the book actually, it seems like it's been out longer. I don't know why that, other than we started it before, but when you said that, for some reason, I thought it was out for 2 years already. So, the thing is, like, I think you said that I said this, this was so much fun. Gene and I, we've been, I think, sort of collaborating for probably at least 10 years now. I mean, I met you
almost,
in South by Southwest, I think is when we had our first kind of sit down, although I was on a panel with you, I think the first DevOps.
2011.
So it was just, the thing about this sort of project was that it was so much pent up knowledge, but then over the last sort of 2 years, year and a half, I've been sort of eating my own dog food. So I'm, like really sort of using some of the things and actually applying it to the forensics I've been doing with large clients. So that's been a lot of fun to actually sort of take the theoretical to the real practical implementations.
Awesome. In fact, I forgot to mention this one note I wrote down right before we started, which was, there's no doubt that it was one of the most rewarding things I've ever worked on. I mean, the places it took us, the people we met, certainly shaped how I think about almost everything these days. I mean, I feel so much better educated as a result of doing that, and especially those panels that we get to do with Dr. Sidney Decker, Dr. Stephen Spear, and Dr. Richard Cook. I mean, that was once in a lifetime.
It was amazing.
So awesome. Let's go to first question, Jeremy.
Great. Yeah, and for the folks that were just joining, feel free to submit any other questions or follow-up questions you have in the chat window or in the Q&A button. With that, we'll take the first question. It comes in from Gunter Schulmeister, and there's a little bit of a background here, which I'll read first before I get to the question. It says, we are trying to implement DevOps in an IT company of about 450 developers and 80 operators doing infrastructure and another 70 doing client and service desk work. As a subsidiary and central IT of a retail company with approximately 30,000 employees, our app portfolio is very diverse. This applies with regard to the area of the applications and the technology used. In addition to the 2 large applications, each with its 50 to 100 developers, we have lots of small teams and with 3 to 10 developers that own 1 to 2 separate applications. The question is, which team topologies would work well in our environment and why?
So, John, you wanted to take a first stab.
Yeah,
right?
So it's interesting. I'm a big fan of that book. I've got an early copy of it at London DevOps Enterprise London, and
specifically Team Topologies by Manuel and Matthew Skelton.
Yeah, I just didn't. I thought, okay, here we are, another framework around DevOps and stuff. But I loved it, and more importantly, is I was actually in London for about a month working with a very large bank. And it fit really well as I was sort of going in and summarizing. A lot of what I do now is sort of low tech. I call it organizational anthropology, where I interview hundreds and hundreds of people and just try to find out sort of the core of their sort of social technical stagnation or just boundaries. And then I have to come up with sort of summaries of like how and the the thing that I really like about the topologies that I think it fits most organizations, and I use it in a lot of my presentations now, is really the three things I think that I took away is they talk about boundaries and understanding team boundaries, and sort of you have to understand the complexity, the domain complexity of a particular group, right? And that's really an art, right? Because as you build sort of, if you go on Scrum routes and you got pods and you're sort of sizing teams, and there's numbers on sizing, 7 to 9, and there's different variants of people who talk about team sizing, but the real complexity is when to sort of stretch out and you put too much. We talk about build run teams, right? Like build run teams or 2 pizza teams, and like so that's sort of a common way we think now is try to sort of work teams that have all the essential skills to manage a service. But the thing is, then you have to sort of temper that or sort of moderate that in a way that you don't put too much load into one team. So there's this art of like knowing when to sort of separate out too much domain expertise or complexity. Complexity of domain. So I think the boundaries, the team sizing, and the third I love is their notion of a team API. So one of the things I talk about with my clients very heavily is you've got to get your sort of taxonomy and you got to get your taxonomies right, and you have to get your sort of structure right. And those are more of those aren't like actual like physical things. Those are like, if you're going to use words, like make sure the words have a definite meaning. Dare to say even a manifesto. So if you're going to call something a DSM, does it mean digital service manager? Does it mean DevOps service manager? And I'll go in an organization and just these simple terms will have so many variants. And then you envision all these groups having constant conversations and meetings where they walk away and they don't even understand the same terminology. So what I like about the team API idea that they talk about is it's sort of into the internal and external. So internal, you set up sort of how your team works, what you're going to do, sort of your sort of agreements, how you're going to, sort of even your empathetic transactions. And then you do an external sort of API. This is an API in technology. This is an API in sort of social, that you say, here's how we're going to interact with the rest of the world. So I find one of the hardest problems in large organizations is people knowing actually how to interact with other teams. And I'll say one last thing, and that is in that thing, you basically could describe like maybe you have a general Slack channel for everybody, and the SLA is 24 hours in an answer. Then you have office hours where so one of the problems with Slack, people say, I hate it because I put something out there and I never know if I'm going to get a response. But if your team sets the boundaries, says, here's our design docs and our wiki, here's how we work, and here's how you communicate with us. And by the way, we even have an SLA on communication, which is general 24 hours, Q&A, office hours, 30 minutes. So anyway, I've been able to use some of that stuff to sort of drive a nice blueprint to fold in what I normally talk about as sort of models and taxonomy in an organization. And I think
it's awesome. Yeah, in fact, I think there's like 2 things that I would opine on here. One is I'm working on a blog post. It's called my love letter to closure, part 1. And it's,
part 1.
Yeah, exactly. Hardest part is to kind of shrink it down. It's actually inspired by the Brian Cantrell's love letter to Rust. Anyway, it reintroduced the joy of coding to me, and it's one of the unexpected side effects is that it's turned me into. It's not only I've self-identified now as a developer, not as an ops person, which has been a change, right? For 20 years, I self-identified as an ops person, but I've turned into a very fussy developer. So I'm like one of those. I just want to live in my pure functional universe, no side effects. I just want to. I don't want to connect to anything because connecting to a database takes a week. I don't want to deal with secrets management. I don't want to deal with configuration files. I don't want to deal with YAML. I don't want to deal with Kubernetes. And so it's just made me. I think one of the things that really it clarified for me is that really we want developers to spend their best energies solving the business problem. And the more you get into infrastructure and even security, right, the further and further you get from the business domain that we really want them to be spending their best energies on. Not to say that it's not important, but it's just something that they shouldn't be spending a lot of time Googling because it's so far out of their kind of the domain that we want them focused on. And so I think that really is the job of the platform teams, right? Infrastructure, security, is put all your expertise in these platforms so that anyone can inherit it just by using those platforms. And I think that the team topologies book just made that case for it so brilliantly. And like all these novel techniques and patterns of like, putting SLAs on communications, even the Slack messages, I think it's just brilliant. And I think the frame for that is comes from Dr. Carlota Perez, that we talk about a little bit in Beyond the Phoenix Project. She said, we've gone through 5 macroeconomic phases, each one caused by a mode of production that is where the cost is rapidly and significantly diminished. And each one led to a boom bust phase, and each one of them created a new mode of management. And so the first one was about oh my gosh, I'm gonna get this wrong. It was Taylorism, Fordism. I think it was actually subcontracting was another one. And I think the big question is like, what is the new mode of management that DevOps will enable, right? The age of information, the age of data, the age of software, whatever you call it. And I think all these things that we're developing, that this community is developing, are all the novel patterns that are just as novel as what Taylorism or Fordism created. I find that just very exciting. So it means to me that in 20, 30 years, they'll look at these patterns and they'll be so adopted and so widespread that everyone can't imagine a world where we didn't have these patterns. I find that just genuinely exciting that this community that we're a part of are minting these patterns. Last comment on that is I was hanging out with John Moore. He's the chief software architect at Comcast last week, and so he'll be bringing a DevOps Enterprise at the end of the month. And he was talking about the role of architecture, and he says it's not architecture as we kind of imagined it 20 years ago. It's more like the IETF proposal process, where it's like you put an RFP, you get comments, right? And it really is giving everybody an opportunity to get their opinions in. It's just that empowering the edges, that new role of these centralized functions. I think it's just so exciting and so different than the way I was trained.
Hey, Gene, do you mind if I riff on 2 points you made?
Yeah.
One is, you mentioned sort of letting developers, like, when you started talking about, I started thinking you were an anarchist. I'm talking about, like, I don't want to connect any database. I don't want to, the purity of sort of functional. And I was thinking about like where I've been right now, and, with sort of, and I don't want to go deep into SRE, but like, I'm going to let everybody off the hook who runs an enterprise who's worrying and spending hours and meetings over and over about whether you should SRE or not. Let me give you the clue here. You're not Google. And the reason I bring that up is, Mark Burgess wrote the foreword to the first SRE book, and he said this brilliant thing about Google. He said, Google has basically built an abstraction such that the non-deterministic world, which is their infrastructure, looks deterministic to their developers. And that is, it was originally called the Borg, then Omega, we see it as Kubernetes. But in their world, the developers don't, again, I never worked in Google. I just sort of pick up the signposts along the way. But the point is, their developers really don't worry about infrastructure. They are completely bounded by program this way. And it affords them so many complexities in the form of non-complexity in that sort of boundary that they created. And I think that's where our industry has to get to, is we have to get, before we sort of leap into error budgeting, and again, I like error budgeting concept, but if you have like 40 dependencies with 5 generations of technology, it gets a little dicey.
Yeah. Right. So they've created a bubble that developers can operate in, insulated from the kind of the uncertainties and messiness of infrastructure.
Right, which is ultimately, I think, is to your point, and I think that, like, why do developers actually want to know the grueling, like Kelsey Hightower said to me one time, he said this, we had a conversation about SRE, and he's at Google, and the question is like, so you create, and I'll do this short, but you create a contract with SRE, you have to go ahead and fulfill a lot of sort of organizational sort of or operational functionality in the service that you're going to hand SRE. You give it to SRE, they say, here's your SLO, here's your cost, right? That's the kind of contract. And then when you go to ask, like, hey, are you going to run it up? They're like, no, you can't ask that question. If I'm running it on a mouse and a wheel, It doesn't matter. I got to hit your SLO. You're going to pay me. Right? And that's a world I'd like to see us get to. And again, I think we have to navigate our way, but I think our patterns, over the heroes in our, you talk about, Mike Nygaard, right? Clearly a hero, Scott Prue, Courtney, Jason Cox, Jeffrey Snover, right? Like and we can go on and on, but I think what we are is hopefully laying a foundation where hopefully we wind up in sort of that pure world. And I think ultimately that's what, what DevOps should be sort of driving.
Right on. Jeremy, and next question comes from Johan Tiegler. In fact, who I think is on the line, so feel free to ask follow-up questions, etc. Jeremy.
Yeah, sounds good. And so there's a few questions that came on from Johan Tiegler, and the first is probably more pointed to Eugene. It says, in what context do you place IT revolution? Who do you see as your neighbors, and who do you see as your alternatives/competitors? Preferably answering from more general to more specific.
Yeah. I think first off, let me say I don't see them as a competitor. In fact, I mean, I'm an admirer. In fact, just to put that into context, one of the things that was career moments, like pinnacle moments in my career, was actually having Tim O'Reilly give a quote for the Phoenix Project. That's still on the back of the book. I have so much admiration for that guy, and I think there's a genius to the way he works, and I don't think it's an accident that he's figured out this configuration between authors, conferences, and so forth. And so I think there's probably no accident that IT Revolution is kind of configured in a similar way, right? I self-identify as an author and a researcher. I know the work I love the most is actually writing, collaborating with people like John. But the area of passion for me is really studying these heroic people who are leading DevOps transformations in large complex enterprises. And, the best way to actually get their story is actually for them to give experience reports. And the best vehicle for that is conferences. And it just creates this community around it, which actually makes for a great source material for books. So I think that's kind of and it's actually a great place to find new authors, which who I also love working with. So, I think that's kind of the pattern that I think Tim O'Reilly must have stumbled upon, and we are also going to look similar. But I think we serve different audiences. If you look at especially in the conference community, I think the other thing that kind of rattles around in the back of my head is like I think what the DevOps enterprise community, the function it serves, is a lot like what professional associations used to. Like I spent almost a decade as a due-paying member of the Institute of Internal Auditors, and it was like one of the best communities I've ever run into in my life. I mean, that was a community that mobilized in the wake of SOX 404 when people were trying to come up with better answers to like how do we, audit and achieve compliance without breaking the bank. So that's 130,000, probably much more now, right? Of people paying dues, right? Creating committees, solving industry-wide problems. Outside of the audit community, I've seen nothing that resembles that. And so I think one of my aspirations is like, how do we mobilize this community and use it to solve industry-wide problems? And it's odd, right? We're having a panel session at DevOps Enterprise at the end of the month of executive directors from all Big Four auditors, just to myth bust, all the DevOps myths. I just feel like there's so many things that we can do that are, grand in scale. So that's one of my own aspirations. I hope that answers your question, Johan. If that doesn't, type a follow up. We're here for you.
Let's go. Let's ask you both maybe the second question from Johan, which was, do you have some kind of knowledge ladder for a different topic in DevOps with recommendations to people on how they can learn and evolve?
Knowledge ladder, John.
Yeah, I think, I'll tie this back to Beyond the Phoenix Project, right? I think when we set out to sort of work through what, the original idea was to, let go. We're at 20 years after the goal, wrote something called Beyond the Goal, right? And me and Gene are both, I think Gene said he's listened to it 20 times. I've probably listened to it like 15 times. I mean, it's something that I try to listen to once a year almost, more.
But I've listened to certain modules at least 20 times.
Okay,
I don't think I've listened to the whole thing 20 times. Just do the math.
No, but the point was, I came to Gene and I said, we probably should do something like this, based on, Phoenix Project, 5 years in. And so we didn't really know where we were going to go originally. Originally, it was really, I wanted to interview him about, like, why did you create the Phoenix Project? And if you've listened to it, and if you haven't, I encourage you to, for not only sort of Gene sort of really dissecting the study. I mean, Gene didn't just copy the goal. I mean, he studied, took PhD, took, MBA classes and again, that's all in the book, but the audio book, but like, so, and then from there we were like, okay, where do we go? And then we thought about, like, what were the 3 pillars? What were the pillars? And it turned out to be 3, right? Lean, safety, and learning organizations. And here's the kicker, right? How do you learn, right? Like, you can read the books, and we can give you the books, right? Like the Phoenix Project, Beyond the Phoenix Project, Accelerate, Team Topologies, Domenica's book, amazing book. Why am I forgetting the name? The 5 Thieves of Time. Help me, Gene.
Yeah, that one.
No,
Make her visit.
We're so dead. No, it's an amazing book. But but here's the thing, that, like, what happened was, like, Gene and I sort of geeked into lean world, right? And Gene, actually Gene got me started with Mike Rother and Steven Spear, and, like, we realized how much was so relevant. John Allspar, reached out to, reading, announced sort of Richard Cook's Why Complex Systems Fail. We talk about all this in the book, right? And he pulled that into our sort of domain of DevOps, and he brought in Sidney Decker and Richard, Dr. Woods, right? And then, Gene and I figured, and actually Andrew Schaefer actually sort of dragged me in, and, Gene was kind of in another way into sort of learning organizations. Pete, I never say his last name right, but Senge, the 5th discipline. And the point was, I think the way we learn is we look for bodies of knowledge. An underutilized work that I wish we would have covered in a book is John Cotta, Learning Organization. I recommend it to everybody. How do you create change in an organization? So I think, for me, again, we can give you the hard list, and the lists are out there in the IT Rev blog and in most of the books. It's not too hard to figure out sort of a chronology of books you should read if you haven't read them. But the real meat is, how do you go out and find those, like, solid works of knowledge in your organization or other parts of your business? Andrew Schaefer talked about in one of his presentations, using game theory, Nash equilibrium, right? How can you, that's where we sort of accelerate the boundaries of our learning. Instead of us just trying to reinvent the wheel all the time, we sort of look for these other and say, oh, that's absolutely relevant and totally fuses with what we're doing.
By the way, the square right in front of the Carlotta President, what will replace Fordism? I mean, I think it's dynamic learning organizations.
Got to be.
And so I guess just to maybe give a weirdly oblique answer. So that Beyond the Phoenix journey, it took us to University of Michigan campus, right, where the DevOps days there, where we ran into Mike Rother, author of Toyota Kata. And that was great fun with Dr. Richard Cook. But kind of this weird memory that stands out for me was actually watching the gentleman from Seattle present on Kahneman and Tversky, thinking fast and thinking slow, as it applies to project management. I mean, it just kind of underscored, like, how much we're teaching each other. And I think there's a reason why internal technology conferences are so powerful, because I went to the Comcast DevOps days. It was amazing. They had the CTO speak of 8,000 engineers saying, here's the top level business goals. Here's what we want everyone oriented towards, right? And the rest is a bunch of technologists teaching each other things. And some of it was, it was just the diversity of things that were being presented and the topics covered were just mind-blowing. And so I think it wouldn't surprise me that, if internal technology conferences and, this kind of free form, here's what I learned and that might be relevant to you. I think that's going to inform kind of what we need to know. A very, very general answer. Question, should we go to Johan's next question?
Yeah, let's go to Johan's next question. And then just as a reminder for everybody, there is a Q&A button you can use to submit additional questions. We had one come in from Michael Schneider as well. We'll get to that one in a second.
Yeah.
But first and foremost, the DevOps forum paper on industrial DevOps was really interesting, and there are some does videos as well. Are you planning to do more with industrial DevOps? And Johan goes on to say, it would be useful at my work, but more important, I think it's very useful to describe DevOps outside of the software community.
Oh, so interesting. So that was the second year working on that. And that was led by Suzette Johnson, Dean Leffingwell, and Suzette Johnson, and and another person I'll never forget. I will look it up in just a second. And so it was our second run at describing kind of DevOps applied to a much more complex surface area where you have like perhaps embedded systems, you have software on top of that, you have components spanning multiple large integrators. I thought it was amazing, and the fact that they put it into a non-Department of Defense setting and said, all right, we're building an autonomous car, and here are the issues, and here's the safety risk. I thought it was just brilliant. I suspect that team is going to go on. In fact, that paper, that forum paper, was cited by one of the top systems engineering conferences as one of the must reads. And so this is where the conference where the top architects and the systems engineering community assemble. I thought that was just a testament to the amazing work they're doing. So Johan, I sure hope I'm pronouncing your name right. You should, I'm going to put my email into the thing, and you should email me, please, and tell me how it's benefited you, and if you want to help contribute to that. Let's see what we can make happen. I think that's the best kind of work these days, is that when you can actually do something that serves a mercenary interest, that a problem that you need to solve, and actually work with fellow community members who also have this problem, and you get to work with the best in the game. I think that's the mark of a great project, and it sounds like you would fit right in there. So just email me, and maybe Jeremy, you can just send my contact information. Yes, the answer is yes, and I'm sure we would love your help. So to be continued.
Sounds great. Awesome. Great. Well, let's transition over to the question from Michael Snyder from the Q&A chat window. It says, "Hey Gene, hope all is well leading up to DOS 19. I wanted to ask if you and John are looking to do any follow-up to the DevOps handbook to capture any more of the cultural leadership or mentality shift within organizations starting the transformation. Also, has anything changed with the continued research from Dora? Thanks.
Yeah.
See you at the conference."
So I think we're always looking for more testimonials and case studies, and I think the best venue for that is actually the DevOps Enterprise Conference. So you should email me. Was it Michael Snyder?
Yep, Michael Snyder.
Yeah, in fact, I think that's the value of experience reports, is just to have everyone be able to say, hey, here's the problem I started to solve. Here's what we thought going in. Here's what worked. Here's what didn't work. Here's the problem that still remained. I mean, and then say, all anchored in here's the organization I'm trying to implement this within, makes for the most killer experience reports. So absolutely yes. And I would say that is so much easier than going in and trying to revise a book. So, in fact, just a little side note for your amusement. For the Unicorn project that's finishing up, I'm wearing my Unicorn project hoodie. In the editing cycle, like there are certain phases where you can't make certain types of edit because it will blow the paginations on the rest of the book and you run out of pages. I mean, it's just it's so hard. It's like one of the constraints of the medium. Anyway, so but hey, if you have a story to share, please reach out to me. I would love to talk, and I'll figure out I will personally commit to you to find the best venue to get that written in, whether it's an addendum to the book, conference, whatever. John, any thoughts on that?
No, just one of the things that I've been, every year I go to Vail for it's basically a financial analyst. I get brought in for emerging tech and all these sort of money market guys, capital funds, guys that do large cap tech investments who want to know about sort of things that might surprise them, sort of emerging tech. And one of the big conversations this summer was the edge. And the complexity. I really wasn't paying attention to people putting they're putting sort of shipping containers by cell towers that are being filled with racks.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, and some people are talking about like, could we use Kubernetes, to, and so our world, in these worlds where like telcos and where people have to, because the inbound of device, the sort of ingress of everything sending in sort of signals, right, are going to have to be filtered way sooner, aggregated, filtered, whatever, even responded, egressed, before they hit some central, body or cloud or whatever, right? So there's a lot of sort of angst in our industry right now about edge, and I just think, I think they touched a little bit on that in the industrial internet, but like this is the stuff that like is going to really hit home for certain sectors in DevOps. Yeah, welcome.
We have a friend. He works on car systems, and he drove home a dev build, and apparently his partner drove it and ran it into a brick wall because in that dev build the proximity sensors weren't enabled.
No.
You laugh about. I mean, it was like create a nightmare.
Problem of managing managing IT at the edge. I mean, we're gonna have millions of data centers theoretically. I don't know exactly what. I will tell you, anybody tries to fill containers with Kubernetes, unmanned, unpeopled containers, racks of Kubernetes is going to have long nights and long days.
Yeah. Well, but, I thought that was just a great example. Like, not only he had to do a lot of paperwork, but I mean, just the safety risk of how many you could run into somebody, right? If you assume that the proximity sensors are going to save you, right?
Can I tell an amazing, crazy story about autonomous vehicles?
No better time.
So at that same conference, I sat in on autonomous vehicles, which was loosely related to edge, right? And I hope I get this right. So somebody was telling this crazy story about a particular car that had been prototyped for, I don't know however, right? It's all sort of ML and deep learning and AI, right? Like that they have to build over time. So they'd send this car out every morning at like 8 and it'd come back at like, I don't know, 6 or something every day, right? So, and this was its learning, right? It was adding sort of its learning, training basically and learning, right? And so once it got basically quasi-production, they noticed that left turns had significantly statistically high, that doesn't make sense, a little bit significant enough to be worried about errors on left turns versus right turns. So they bring in like these heavy hitter algorithm people, right? Like, the top of the top, the people who have to solve the real hard algorithm problems. And they work on it and they work on it. And it's almost like the Abraham Wald, aha, where the bullets aren't. And I'm sorry to do that to everybody if you hadn't heard this story. But then somebody figured out that actually when the car was coming back to wherever they were sort of doing the engineering, it would make left turns to get there. And it was sort of a purple haze most nights. And part of its learning was to behave differently when it saw purple. And so you never see purple on the road, except enough to be significantly interesting for errors. So literally it was that the way it learned was like that color purple became part of the pattern. It was so embedded, right? This is the complexity of the world we're about to be in. Anyway, I thought that was a fascinating.
Yeah, machine learning, very difficult. And by the way, I just last question was about what is Dora? How is Dora doing these days? Yeah, I think it's great. I'm a little bit further away from that now, but Nicole and Jez are both at Google full time, and one of the things I'm most excited about in the findings is they're linking some of the Dora work to the Project Oxygen, Project Aristotle rework stuff, and so Google spent years studying how to make great teams great. And so to be able to, Nicole, to be able to get access to that data, I mean, that's like freaking awesome. So more great years ahead, I'm sure. Jeremy.
Awesome. Cool. We had another question come in from William Judd. And William says, I find that so many books about DevOps have something of a split brain problem, trying to generalize findings for both large enterprise IT orgs as well as software development enterprises. They seem to trend more towards IT ultimately, which makes some lessons a bit harder to apply to software product organizations. Do you foresee specialization in the DevOps literature such that some books may focus on the IT function in large enterprises while others focus on software business?
Hey, John, can I just say a brief story about?
Sure, yeah.
So I've been studying high performing technology organizations for 20 years. So I've been studying that for 20 years. Around 2012, there was a slight change in my language because around 2012, maybe it was 2013. Here's the way I used to introduce myself. I've been studying high performing IT organizations since 1999. It was actually John Allspaw who said, IT, what's IT? That's the people who give us laptops. I just thought it was like one of these kind of weird perspectives that I'm like, yeah, I mean, that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about like technology as an enabler, as the competitiveness and edge that creates durable business advantage, right? And it is interesting, right? I mean, I actually just dropped IT from my language entirely, and I forgot to make that point explicitly in the Unicorn Project. But I mean, it really is like there's this kind of terrible association of like concepts to IT when really it's like when I think IT, like these are the mission critical system of records. These are what enable the rest of the enterprise. They're the custodians of data. They're responsible for the most important business processes in the organization. So it's a shame that we have to sort of and it's kind of so distinctly, as you say, split brain, right? They have certain practices for the system of engagement to the dev teams or the feature teams or the software delivery functions versus quote IT, the back office. When ultimately I think really we should be treating them almost uniformly as a population, independent of whether we use commercially off the shelf software or not. John, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I have a lot of
yeah.
I have a lot of thoughts about this. I mean, I put my satirical hat on and say the inmates are running asylum. But what I'll say here is this: over the last 2 years, I've worked with some really large organizations, large banks, at least 2 top 10 banks. I worked with large sort of industrial manufacturing, smart factories. And the thing when we talk about DevOps, Damon and I sort of coined this thing called CAMS, Culture, Automation, Measurement, Sharing. I'm not doing a plug for ourselves, but there's a part of DevOps that has really nothing to do with the technology. Right. And that part is going to be consistent regardless. They're sort of, in physics, you have these sort of variables that are mutable to scale. Right. And so these are the things that are basically sort of immutable to whether you're a large hospital or you're a large sort of manufacturing or a bank or you're basically a 400 person, kind of first tier mature startup. Right. The point is these things are just consistent. It's about sort of behavior patterns. It's, I think the Ron Westrum cultural topology sets a good framing for that. Those are going to be consistent across the board. How you think about failure, blamelessness, all that stuff. And then there's sort of a second tier, which I think, which is where you have to start differentiating. In fact, there's a second tier. Again, I think it's layered, right? The first tier is immutable for everybody. So there's no split brain on the first tier, first layer, if you want. The second or third layer, and whether they're fused, is where we get confused about, like I mentioned earlier, about SRE, not to rant on SRE, but where we get advice that sort of its evolution comes from purely startup greenfield cloud titans, Google or
Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google,
right, Amazon, and those are absolute the right principles in terms of directionality. But when we try to apply those, and they're more social technical, right? In a large enterprise that has 5 generations of technology, where again, people don't realize this. The top 100 banks in the world still run their system of record on IBM mainframes. Right. And if you pick up your iPhone or your iPad or whatever, and you try to communicate with either Delta or whatever your bank is, most likely, you're basically going to hit a transaction back on an IBM mainframe. So that's where it gets sort of, and again, I know you were kind of talking about the difference between software and sort of large IT, but in these large IT, they're still, they've got all variant stages. They still have back office IT, where it takes 2 weeks still to get a VM, right? We think everything is like, cloud, everything. And you walk into this large, top 5 bank, and there are large pockets in the organization that's still waiting 2 weeks, 4 weeks to get a firewall change.
So Yeah,
And they're scratching their head saying, well, wait a minute. And I think the CEOs now are like, wait a minute, like, can somebody explain this madness? Everybody tells me I have to be like Google and Amazon and Facebook. And I look at my organization and nobody in my organization can explain to me how the hell I can do that. And so I think that's the fun and exciting part really right now.
right. In fact, I mean, I think there's kind of two, so I kind of gave a very long way of saying, I think we treat them kind of as two different things. And I think the goal of the DevOps Enterprise Summit was really to say that, it is as much for the large complex organizations and it's, 70-year, history of computing, right, as it is for Facebook and then Netflix, Google. And I think the best example of that has been Scott Prue, from CSG, where, he inherited an application that was written at First Data, and I think it was in 1977. And that's young compared to some of the apps that John's seen lately. But to see this year, I've asked him. Okay, I don't want, as much as I love his talks, I asked him to specifically talk about the technology and architectural transformations, and I'm so excited about it. I think it's gonna be one of the best talks because he's showing like the amazing engineering feats that are required to be able to bring the same level of agility and reliability to those applications of which there are 136 million subscribers to, as it would the most modern parts of that application stack. So I think that's really exciting. And, so I think I've kind of so I think we've kind of avoided some of those things to be able to say, just wait, one more thing. So, I mean, I want to say this, it shouldn't be a split brain thing. And I think one of the things I'm hoping Courtney Kissel will be able to talk about, she has a new role at Nike where she's SVP of all of what they call Move. So she owns now basically all of the back office supply chain systems. And, they're having to make decisions, like, can we really become, in fact, there's a new goal within teams saying we want to be the world's #1 supply chain company, right? I think they recently dropped off the top 5. And you can't do that with antiquated technology. And so, they're, grappling with, how many warehouse management systems should we really have? Is it, should it be like tens or it should be one? Can we really do it using an SAP instance that hasn't been updated in, 20 years? And I'm making these numbers up, but you can imagine the class of stories that impede greatness. Those are the stories I think that will really puncture the myth that, that there are really two classes of systems. Sorry, John.
Yeah, just want to be clear, because if you remember when we, there was an argument before we did the first DevOps Enterprise Summit about whether enterprise had to do it differently than sort of the startup. The DevOps was being sort of put in a bucket of this is just startup stuff. And there was original Mythbusters actually as a forum paper, but and I said, we'll know. And then when we got the first set of CFPs, right, there were like 150 proposals for the first DevOps Enterprise Summit, and a bunch of them were vendors, but like more than half of them were large enterprises saying, really telling us what we all believed, which is you didn't have to do it differently. And I firmly believe that. My only constraint now is there's these flanking meta models that are coming in and putting a lot of, take for example, you look at what like, I think of like Courtney, Jason Cox, and Scott Prue are heroes because they do these things on their own cadence. They don't get, I remember one time talking to Scott and they're saying like, yeah, like we're going to wait on infrastructure as code because we want to fully understand it, right? Like they don't run on other people's, Jason, if you listen to the way Jason described how they run SRE there, they call it system reliable engineering, not site. So we don't have no sites. The point is there are people that are sort of in the DevOps Enterprise Summit sort of group that are doing these things, but I think a lot of companies out there that don't have the kind of leadership are hearing these sort of flanking things and thinking, oh, I have to do error budgets or I have to do this, and that's the part that sort of where I think we get some of the split brainism happening.
Yeah. William, I just texted you. I hope that at least partially answered your question. If not, ask a follow-up. No better time. Thanks. Jeremy.
Great. And just a reminder for everybody, we will be sending out this recording after the fact. So you will definitely get a recording of this for everybody to view later. That being said, we have a few questions in from Jarek McWilliams. The first being, this might have already been asked, but what are your impressions of the recently published Team Topologies by Manuel Pace and Matthew Skelton. And we did touch on that at the very beginning, right, Gene?
Yes, John, you want to give the 30-second?
Yeah, I thought it was really good. And if you go back and listen earlier, I talked about some specific techniques that I learned from the book to actually use with my clients.
I think it was just, I thought it was a great piece of work. That was awesome. There's like 5 things I want to say, but I'll leave them inside my head. I thought it was great. And
awesome.
European authors.
Great, awesome. And the second question from Jarek was, what are some ideas y'all have had for a better name for DevOps that encompasses the domains that aren't just Dev or Ops?
John, you.
Yeah. Again, I sound like the ranting old man, but I am, I guess, a ranting old man these days. Originally, the DevOps was, all right, originally founded on this original core conflict between sort of dev and ops. And then the original, it was actually Andrew Schaefer's original wall of confusion. Dev was throwing stuff over this wall and ops would catch it and say, it doesn't work. They'd throw it back. And in his sort of, presentation that he did in 2009, the same conference where Allspar did his 10 deploys a day. His wasn't videotaped, but he started smashing the wall. But what happened, then it was QA, and so what I think people who really looked at it never really saw it as just dev and ops. It was a metaphor for basically creating sort of flow and fluency, collaboration between teams that have constraints. And the name, just like cloud is not whatever the scientific definition of a cloud is. It's a metaphor for a thing, right? So for me, DevOps has always been really more of a metaphor, and I think people who try to do DevOps, MAR, Sec, this. Now, one caveat, because people that do know me will say, John, you're full of it because you've been pretty heavy on DevSecOps.
In fact, you have a book coming out called DevSecOps.
But on that one, I felt, I even took the hypocrite flag and said on this one, I felt we had to do something like, what do they call it? Where you have to sort of blow it up, right? It's, at this point, the security and sort of DevOps, the security and sort of just general transformation were just so far apart. And the danger flags of that happening were just, catastrophic, right? The Equifaxes, all these breaches, and something had to be done that just stood in people's face. And DevSecOps basically brought security people in way faster than if we just kept saying DevOps. So I'll take the hypocrite flag. And I always say, I really want the day where we don't have to use the word DevSecOps anymore. And I think it's happening. And we just go back to like, there's one word, and it encompasses all the sort of metaphoric things that can't collaborate.
I think I proposed should be DevSecOps handbook.
Yes, yeah, we're working on it. Yep.
You yelled at me. You're like, that's you convinced me that like we shouldn't mess with the name.
It brought a lot of security. At RSA, we run a whole DevOps track, and like the security people come in droves. When we were calling it a DevOps track, they weren't coming as much. In RSA, the security people weren't showing up to the extent now the real security people are showing up heavily in the DevSecOps.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? I mean, we need them to show up, right? Like we need them to.
We have to.
Whether the developers and infrastructure stuff, right? Yeah.
You've got QA in, early, everybody thinks like in the early days of DevOps, we got it. Okay, now we got to go to the QA people and get their buy-in. Oh, they're not going to like this, you're going to eliminate their job. And it was not a hard sell and not an easy sell, but, we had to convince them like, this is how we want to create fluency and collaboration and speed. We need your knowledge embedded in the pipelines, right? And in every team that we've gone to try to, kind of convince to join the party, and it just, security was a bridge too far, where I think we had to actually sort of blow up the name.
Yeah, so that's the book that you're working on with Ernest Muller,
James Wickett, and Shannon Leeds, who is the most amazing security person on the planet.
Yes, awesome. Jeremy.
Great. We have another question from Johan Tiegler. Johan says, thanks for the AMA. They're on a train right now with limited communication, so it's hard for them to follow everything, but how do you view all the different organizations, conferences, and standards like IEEE and INCOSE, ISO 15288, EA, DevOps.com, ITIL, Disciplined Agile, etc. It's hard for me. Does IT Revolution recommend some of these as an expansion in neighboring areas from what you focus on?
Oh, great questions about like the kind of landscape. It's interesting. I like them all. In fact, DevOps.com. In fact, we both came from the security community. Alan Schimmel, almost 15 years ago, we worked a lot with the RSA conference, and he once helped me out on a very specific problem that involved the B-Sides community, the sort of like DevOps days and the RSA mothership, the RSA security conference. Anyway, so they're all good. I don't really opine much on other organizations. I mean, I think it is a fact that there's so many problems that need to be solved. We need to up-level, 28 million people's skills, and regardless of what domain they came from. And I think any organization that can help their constituencies do that is, doing good things. So I'm not the best person to grade anybody on, how well they're achieving their mission. And I'm certainly, I was talking with John before the thing, there's certain arguments on Twitter I just stay clear of, just because I just don't want to get dragged into that, like, at all. So anyway, that's just the way I'm wired. John, you have anything to add on that?
No, I think you hit it. Like, there's really big problems out there, like upskilling, what this industry is going to need. I think we really sort of, every time we put, the one thing I sort of love John Osbar for, but sometimes cuss him, is like the thing about like everything that has an abstraction around it can sort of encapsulate or theory, right? Like it my way, not his, right? And so I've got nothing against any organizations, but I do think when we sort of enclave them into this, we lose this opportunity to sort of think at a level above this. And so I think,
who is he? And so he's trying to promulgate this very important work about safety culture, right, into every other field, right? And so he needs all these other kind of guilds and.
Well, I get it. Yeah, I get it.
To come on board.
But hey, we're all like hypocrites on our worst. Sorry. But again, and he's not. I'm not saying that. I truly believe that, like, this idea that, like, the more that you put sort of, even for myself, when I do practice, right, I try to walk in and say, we're not going to talk about DevOps. We're not going to talk about SRE. We're not going to talk about Agile. Like, these are not the way you solve the systemic social technical problems. Yeah. You have to sort of get rid of all those things and then sort of find the patterns that are like, or not enabling you to scale. And then we can have real honest conversations about like Agile or SRE, right, or, so I think that, and then I got to put my plug in, my good buddy Alan and I are partners in digitalanarchist.com, and we're trying to work that through. So,
yeah, by the way, one of the most, I would say, dispiriting things in the Beyond the Phoenix project was like the conversation with Dr. Cook and Sidney Decker, right? The mere commoditization of trying to bottle up learning and peddle it, right? Whether it's through books or training or whatever, right? It almost is kind of the antithesis of what we really need. At first, I kind of like, I'm not sure if it was a very strong sense of anxiety when I heard that. But it shows us that there's this very universal problem of the instant you try to bottle up something and replicate it, it does sometimes have unintended consequences. Yeah.
I mean, you need both. You need both, right? You need to be able to look at both lenses. And one lens is, there are bodies of work that give you, there are these sort of abstraction sort of bodies or boundaries that give you a lot of knowledge about a subject that would be hard to research if they were just spread across the universe.
Right.
But at the same time, you need to make sure that you use the other lens by not letting those sort of bound you by sort of, what would I call it? It's sort of the tribal nature of that sort of boundary. Right, because that's where you get in trouble. Right, it's the tribal nature of these things that become the conference for 20 years that becomes sort of institution, and it almost becomes a parody of itself. Right, and then again, not saying any of those two, but
by the way, I'm going to tell my John all spot stored, and everyone should know how much we admire them. But
Yeah, big time.
talking about like how in the functional programming community, we love the phrase "to reason about." Right? You want code that you can actually reason about. That means to understand, to be able to test in isolation, etc. And he kind of scolded me saying, "Why use the word reason about when you can just say to understand?" And I remember looking at the tweet, and I'm like, this is coming from the person who uses the most obscure language, right, from the safety culture community.
Yeah.
Talking about parochial language. I chose not to reply, but it just shows you how funny.
I think there's some really good points here to be thought about our, if we're actually purveying knowledge to people, is don't get into sort of the tribal, like, the joke about Kinevin, again, brilliant framework, but like go tweet something about go do a Wikipedia and get an old diagram of Kinevin, call one of the quadrants, one of the old names, and you'll have 10 people yelling at you. And then you'll say, well, where do I find out about it? And it's like, well, you got to know where it's like those nightclubs that nobody knows where they are. Except, we got to be real careful in our industry to sort of set this sort of those type of things where we're, I don't know if you remember, situational awareness, right? John asked us, this is a great, like in the DevOps handbook, right? John had asked us to remove it. And I spent like a whole Christmas researching why it was valid to remove it. And for those, Simon Wardley, mapping, and like Simon's another guy that I can kind of make fun of, but I love him dearly. I work for him at Canonical, and, he's a dear friend of mine. But go ahead and tell him that John Osbar and Dr. Wood and Sidney Stecker opinion about situational awareness, and you want to see like grenades and like that'll blow up in the sky worse than any 4th of July you've ever seen, right? Like it's pretty hilarious, right? So there's two, a guy like Dr. Woods and Simon Wardley, both geniuses, and if we talk about a panel, put those two together and like debate situational awareness, you want to see like a hilarious, and that just shows you the tribal nature of how we communicate, and that's
tribal, parochial, right?
Parochial is a better word, yeah. So yeah.
Awesome, Jeremy.
There was a follow-up question about where people can go to learn more about the upcoming DevSecOps book.
Oh, I don't think you can.
Yeah, we're working on it. It takes time to write a book, especially with 4 authors. So there's 5 years to DevOps handbook. So
yeah, I think you now know everything that there is to know. The authors. I'm excited about the project. I mean, there's no better. I seriously couldn't think of a better group of people to write it. And I say that because I saw James Wickett give a talk in, I think it was 2012. And it was about this Renegade project inside of National Instruments. And it was the first DevOps initiative. It was James Wickett kind of volunteering to be the security lead on it, knowing nothing about it, but caring deeply. Ernst Muller as the team lead, the Renegade manager who broke all the traditions, patterns, and norms to get it done. Shannon Leith is at Intuit and is creating more of those incredibly novel practices. And then you have John Willis as the ultimate boundary spanner. I mean, man, that was like no better team to write that book.
Yeah, no, it's again, it's just it's hard writing a book with 3 other authors.
Coming 2027. But
Awesome.
it'll be great.
Very cool. Very good. Regarding academic research and papers, is IT Revolution planning to do any collaborations with universities in the future?
There are, very loosely. In fact, I keep this list of all of the curriculums that use our books in their curriculums. As like Arizona State University. There's a graduate course at Harvard. There's one at MIT. There's one at University of Virginia. I would say it's very informal at this, but there are some projects where we're doing kind of these primary research where we'd love to open source the data and actually engage, some of the best researchers, academic researchers. We can never make that work with the State of DevOps report for various reasons, but that's not to say that I'm not still trying. So it'd probably be in other research projects, but the answer is yes. Yes.
Yeah,
Awesome.
in fact, Gene, me and you are alumni teachers of the Harvard. I guess I finally made the grade. I taught a class at Harvard. It's just a one day, but you taught you
Oh yeah, right. With
early this year. I did my guest lecture there. So
oh good,
yeah.
good. Yeah. So it's great to see these awesome organizations, just how they're in 20 years it will be no big deal because every university curriculum will be doing it, but
Totally.
now it's they're not as common as we want them to be. Oh, here's a question for you, John.
Yeah,
Oh,
John,
yes.
there's a question for you as well about DevOps Cafe. Is it gonna any chance?
Yeah, it isn't. Although the rumor mill is it's over and dead, it's actually not. We're actually trying to schedule Jane Grohl. We actually, because of some of my experience in these large banks with these just complex ITSM and ITIL requirements. I want to have this real bare knuckles conversation with Jane about like how can we get from 70 sort of non-functional kind of service basically GRC, right? Like I'm having a whole thing about sort of cloud native and GRC, and I'm going on a crazy rant these days and how the two worlds are just so disconnected. But, most organizations sort of bound their governance, risk, and compliance around sort of ITSM and or good portions of it. And those systems are so broken beyond repair, although they're necessary. Right? So long story short, the plan is hopefully within next week or two, we'll actually have Jane on a really sort of, hard hitting, like, let's get really down to like, how do we narrow this down?
DevOps Cafe is back, and
yes.
first episode will be Jane Grohl from the ITIL community.
I know it. That's the one. Yes. So that's the one we're trying to get scheduled. Maybe that'll get us back in the summer. Then, thing is, so successful at Rundeck, it's really screwed up our podcast. Stop buying his product, y'all. It's screwing up our podcast. He has no time for me. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm so happy that Rundeck is doing so well. It's awesome.
That's great. By the way, Jane Grohl, I've known since 2004 in the ITIL communities, which is, I guess you could say where it came from. That's great. I thought it was kind of funny though. The ITIL is now on DevOps Cafe. Who would have thought that?
Who would have thought?
8 years ago. By the way, just as a quick, not a joke, but it's like a real thing. I was talking to a person I've known for a very long time, Tomer Groshoni. He was the chief product security officer at HPE, now part of Micro Focus. But he was saying, back in the day, even 10 years ago, the security officer would primarily live inside that GRC tool, like Archer or whatever, right? That's where you sort of open up the issues, right? That's where you sort of, do your compliance reporting. And he said, if it doesn't live in Jira or whatever, right, it doesn't exist. I don't care how many times you open it in the GRC tool. If it's not in front of developers in their daily work, it might as well not exist. I thought that was such a great testament to like just how much things have changed even in 10 years, and about the need to bring security into where the work is performed, as opposed to this distant silo, right, where no one cares.
Well, they don't know. I mean, it's I kind of make this joke that on the 6th floor you have sort of the service management ITIL people. The 7th floor you have sort of the DevOps savvy people. And the 8th floor you have the cloud native folk, and none of them are talking to each other, right? And they use different language. They have overlapping language, and the problem is a lot of sort of the functional policies in large banks. I've become sort of an expert in banks. I've done 3 or 4 banks over the last 2 years where I've learned more than I ever want to know about the banking industry. But like their policies are mostly, a lot of them are still sort of bounded by 1990s thinking, physical, I mean, one guy told me this crazy story. This is anybody who understands distributed computing will just laugh their butt off here, that every time they have to do a project, there's a large bank, a project on Amazon, they have to re-explain to somebody the business continuity attributes of S3. And 33 nines is not a single word answer they can use.
33 nines.
What that equates to, again, not being a mathematician or physicist or astrophysicist, whatever, is I think it means that out of all the atoms in the universe, one would have to exist before your data would be lost.
Oh, these are the
31
durability.
lines is what S3 is, right? So I mean, to have to write up a whole sort of 2-paragraph explanation of the business continuity of S3 as a data store, right? Like, I mean, this is the world, the disconnectivity
Right.
between some of these companies and their sort of policy, which drives their risk, which then manifests itself in sort of non-functional requirements. It's just out of kilter.
By the way, just to be clear, this is the durability guarantees of S3, not the availability guarantees. In other words, for the data to be retrieved, right, or lost.
If you want to get into Cap Theorem, buddy, we can go right now.
I think I'm right.
Partition. Yeah, I mean, availability. I mean, I think it's availability. Yep. Yeah, so.
Okay. All right, Jeremy, do you have one last question?
Yeah, let's wrap it up with this question that seems to be getting a lot of action on Twitter right now. It's a 5-part question. So each of you give us your first language, programming language, the one you've had most difficulty with, the one you've used most, the one you totally hate, and the one you love most.
Can you post that to all of the participants? I would love to actually get theirs as well.
Sure.
Yeah. So for me, here, let me, John, why don't you go first while I.
All right. So yeah, like most people aren't even going to know these, right? My first language is something called PL1, which was an IBM. It was actually a derivative of an IBM internal language, which actually was a fascinating language anyway. So look it up. It's PL/1. The truth is, I spent a lot of time. I kind of missed the whole object-oriented. Like I did a lot of functional, and like I did sort of Prolog stuff. I did early languages. I spent most of my time writing mainframe assembler. Actually, that probably is really my most loved language. I should fix that. But and so I missed the whole object oriented. And then I remember taking these night classes to learn C++, and it really hurt my brain. I mean, it was like by the time everybody was an expert in object oriented coding, I was like, this stuff is weird. And actually, I think my original senses were right. Like, you know, the way people were doing object and object models just became, I think, just sort of washed out a little bit. Anyway, I guess most used these days is Python just because it's my sort of go-to utility language. You know, I do, mostly I'm doing sort of meta things with clients. I don't do a whole lot of coding, but every once in a while I'll deep dive into something. I do want to give, I'm going to, this over the holidays, I want to do a hard push. I got a project idea for Go, so it may be replaced by Go next year. But right now, Python with some of my data science and stuff like that, and just it's easy for me to do statistics and all that good stuff. Nobody, if you've heard of this one, you get a free drink or whatever you want as a replacement of alcohol at DevOps Enterprise Summit. If you've heard of C-List, it was a notoriously terrible early generation. Iterative language for IBM mainframes. And I'm going to go find some of the code where you had to do inverse variables. So it'd be ampersand, 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 name, which actually mean that it was a table embedded. It hurts the soul. You know, like if a soul has like a 1,000,000-year life cycle, like you lost like, you know, 100,000 years by just learning that. And then, you know, I guess I got to change my answer. I started out doing 10 years mainframe assembly. It's the most purest language there is. You know, again, go back to there's no abstractions. You know, back in the day, one instruction, one instruction code, one, you know, your principle of operations. There's the code. Like no ambiguity of what you're doing. Although when I was doing the Tivoli Windows stuff, I got heavily into JavaScript server side, and that was actually before they called it Node. And I that's where I fell in love with object oriented. Like that's how I sort of, and then, you know, and as a side, Prolog has always been sort of a fun.
You're geeking out about that. Yeah, for me, first language basic. Languages I've had the most difficulties in to date is R. And Clojure. Clojure took me probably 60 hours of reading and watching videos before I could write my single line of code. But it is what brought the joy of coding back into my daily life. But that I definitely got over. R. I still can't get my head around it, despite all my friends saying it's the way to go. Most used is Clojure, and it's also my most loved. And language I really just hate spending time on is JavaScript. It's just there's so many sharp edges. Just the amount of mental cycles you need to sort of avoid those rough edges. I've just learned to avoid it. But it actually was what I started getting into about 4 years ago. And I think the feeling was man, if this is what coding feels like, I'm not sure if this is actually as fun as what I thought it was going to be, and maybe it's not for me anymore. Luckily, there is a better way. Clojure, for sure, my most loved language.
Excellent. Well, that was great. Thank you both for your time today. We really appreciate it. I don't believe there's any more questions. However, if anyone does have any follow-up questions or comments, feel free to email us. We'll be happy to get back to you. Looks like Michael's actually commenting here in the chat window. That's great. And there will be a recording of this as well available to everybody. So stay tuned for that. We'll follow up via email with that link as well. But again, any final closing thoughts to you, Gene, or to you, John?
Oh, no. Thank you so much for your support in the Beyond the Phoenix project. Like I said, it was like, what I keep saying, like, it was the most rewarding project where just adventure with John to explore the nooks and crannies of lean, safety culture, and the learning organization was one of the most worthwhile in my professional career. So,
I'm going to make Gene gush here a little bit. I mean, you know, I throw a lot of ideas at Gene, and, you know, he basically tempers a lot of them, but every once in a while one breaks through. And there's been some good ones. The panel was one, and then this one. And I'm trying to get him on one new one, so we'll see how that goes. But it's just like the place you let me go, Gene, because of just what you've done in this industry is just like, again, I can't thank you enough. And I think the industry needs it, and they do. Again, you put a stake in the ground in a way that like has afforded me to have a voice that I would have never had. So I wanted to thank you for that.
Oh, likewise, buddy.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. And again, if you need anything else from that 2 Revolution team, feel free to reach out via email, Twitter, or anywhere else, and we'll be getting back to you shortly. Thank you, everybody.